Yeah, the
Yeah.
statistics, I often say we're living in a crisis of purpose, meaning
Yes.
all of the statistics about quality of life are going up on average. There are exceptions,
Right.
but we're more prosperous, we're safer, we're healthier basically than at any point in history. But those have disconnected from happiness, from joy, from a sense of meaning and purpose, from a sense of connection, where all the statistics, at least over the last 20 years or so, have been headed in the wrong direction. I think there are a lot of reasons for that.
Welcome to the Grit Factor, where we dive into the hard-earned lessons of leaders who have lived the challenge, so you walk away with the mindset and the playbook to lead and live with purpose and with your Grit Factor. I'm Shannon Huffman Polson. Today we're tackling one of the most important and misunderstood topics in leadership: purpose. My guest is John Coleman, the co-CEO of Sovereign's Capital and fellow Harvard Business Review author. He also happens to be one of the more thoughtful practitioners of purpose in leadership today. And here's where it gets interesting. John says most of us are getting purpose wrong. In this episode, we'll unpack the biggest mistakes people make when they talk about purpose, and more importantly, how you can avoid them. You'll hear how to clarify your own purpose, how to lead with it in times of uncertainty, and how the grit factor grounds you when everything else feels in flux. If you've ever wondered, am I thinking about purpose the wrong way? How do I get it right? This conversation is for you. Let's take off. Well, John, it's great to have you on the show with the Grit Factor. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, Shannon, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to talk to another HBR author and somebody who is as passionate about purpose as I am, and somebody who I read in one of your bios also has a bearded dragon at home.
I do. Yeah. Well, technically, my 11-year-old son has a bearded dragon, but we all kind of have it as a family. They're great pets.
They are great pets. We have a 12-year-old son, and technically it is his as well, although I find that the responsibility has very rapidly morphed to be more expansive, as it does.
Doesn't it? Yeah, parents do end up with a little more responsibility for pets than we intend. Yeah, that's for sure.
We do. Well, we'll certainly come back to the idea of family, I know, because that's a big piece of how it is that most of us construct purpose in our lives. And I want to talk about the idea of construction and the idea of building and the idea of mining and all of these things that you bring out in your HBR guide to crafting your purpose, which I'll hold up here for the video purposes, and I'll have linked in the show notes for those who are listening. But I wondered if we could start with the very first story that you offer in this book. And what I love about this book, among many things, besides that you're coming from your own experience, you're offering a number of different frameworks that people can actually apply in their lives right now, but that you also look at all kinds of people that come from all types of backgrounds. And I think that really helps to bring forth immediately the egalitarian nature and need for purpose. So maybe share a little bit about the very first story that we enter into crafting your purpose suggests, which is the story of Curtis Jenkins.
Yeah, so Curtis is a wonderful guy. I actually encountered this story online. It went viral a few years ago. And Curtis was a bus driver in the Dallas School District. And he was just the most remarkable guy. And somehow a news station learned about it. And they did a video of it that went viral. And Curtis's life has changed a lot. I've spoken to him about it. But the idea was that he was this bus driver who took remarkable care of the kids on the bus. And all of your listeners should go look up this video. I think it's a school bus driver special delivery was the news segment. And you hear Curtis, and bus drivers like a hard job. I used to sit on the board of a public school system. Kids can be unruly. Buses can be difficult to manage. It can be monotonous. And yet somehow Curtis had changed this job that so many people would think of as difficult or monotonous into this remarkable source of meaning in his life and the lives of others. And the video was just full of these testimonies of kids talking about the difference he'd made in their lives. He treated them like his own kids in a way. He gave them all roles on the bus, the president and the secretary and the police officer on the bus. He would learn about their lives. He would give them trinkets to kind of commemorate big things that happened, like them writing a book or whatnot. And he really became one of the most important adults in these kids' lives. I mean, one of the kids, it always makes me tear up on the video, talked about how he wished he'd had a dad like Curtis. And I thought that was the perfect encapsulation of the core message I was trying to communicate in the book, which you touched on, which is almost any job in the world can be meaningful. They have meaning in them. It's just our responsibility to shape them that way, to surface that meaning. And whether you're a bus driver, or a teacher, or a doctor, or a business person, there's always a way you can do good in the lives of others and really endow your work with meaning. And Curtis was just the best example that I could find of that. I've spoken to him in the course of writing the book, and since he was actually promoted into a new job in Dallas where he was running culture for the school system as a result of some of what people had seen. So I'm always a little sad he's not on the school bus anymore, but I'm glad that he's able to share, that philosophy with others. And it was cool to meet him just because his heart is so good for this stuff. I mean, you can tell he's a grandparent and parent. He just loves kids, and he really has a passion for making their lives better. And he was able to live that out in the course of a job that others might not find so meaningful.
Absolutely. It's just incredible, incredibly inspiring in so many regards. And inspiring, especially in a time, and you get into this in the very beginning as well, where the statistics are pretty poor, right? I mean, our levels of anger are up, our levels of depression are up, the level of stress and worry is up. And there is a couple of polls and surveys done by McKinsey in the wake of the pandemic, I'm sure you're aware of, that looked at one of the problems with this massive workplace disruption being a lack of connection, not to the organizational purposes, which people are demanding, depending on the generation, but a lack of connection to our own individual purposes. Where did
Yes.
we lose this? And why have we lost this?
Yeah, the statistics, I often say we're living in a crisis of purpose, meaning all of the statistics about quality of life are going up on average. There are exceptions, but we're more prosperous, we're safer, we're healthier basically than at any point in history. But those have disconnected from happiness, from joy, from a sense of meaning and purpose, from a sense of connection, where all the statistics, at least over the last 20 years or so, have been headed in the wrong direction. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Um, I think there's been a breakdown in institutions, in social connectivity. There was a great book by a guy named Robert Kaplan 30, 40 years ago now called Bowling Alone, talked about how isolated we had become. There have been various other books that talk about the impact of things like social media, like Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation now, I think is quite good on this.
So good.
And so there are a lot of ways in which people have disconnected. There's been a decline in religious faith, which was often a source of purpose for people. And so we've kind of declined in our trust of institutions and our social connections and our involvement in things in our community and our religious traditions, but we haven't found a way to replace that. And certainly at work, even this push we've seen with the start with why for corporate purpose hasn't translated into people feeling more meaningful at work. If you look at global surveys, only around 15 to 20% of employees feel engaged at work. And if you,
Yes. It's
yeah,
terrible, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of terrifying as well, really.
Yeah, I mean, you think that 4 out of the 5 people you walk into the office with every day are not engaged in their work, which is a good proxy for purpose. And you look around the world and it's not that high anywhere. They did a survey, I think it was Gallup recently, where they looked by country at what percentage of people found a significant source of meaning or purpose in their work. The number one rated country was Italy, where around 43% of people said they found purpose in their work. But a variety of huge economies were towards the bottom. So South Korea had 6%, meaning that 19 out of 20 people said they found no meaning or purpose at work. In the United States, I think the number was 17% found meaning or purpose at work. And hey, it was just a bit north of that. And so it's really a disconnect right now. And I think it's complicated, so I wouldn't try and oversimplify it. But I think we've lost a lot of the traditional areas in which we used to find meaning and purpose. Our workplaces have been disconnected from our communities often, and so we don't find as much meaning and purpose in those. And that's led to this crisis of purpose where we're struggling to replace all these things that we've abandoned with something new that gives us meaning. And I think that's one of the core problems we have to solve actually in our era.
Yes, I could not possibly agree more. I have looked at this from the lens of grit and resilience in the grit factor and came out with what ultimately is the grit triad. And that bottom commit phase is owning your story and connecting to purpose. And frankly, it's critical for any kind of ability to be resilient in difficult times. And we're seeing a lack of that resilience and a lack of that grittiness, I think in part because of this lack of engagement and this lack of purpose. But it goes much deeper than that. And I love how you've really expanded on that in crafting your purpose. Before we get into the specifics in the book, because I think it's really important for people who are living in the midst of the challenges, which we all are, and we're seeing in many regards, maybe even accelerate in a lot of different sectors. How did you become interested in this in your own life and work? And was there some kind of a moment that was pivotal for you, maybe as a young person or even later in your life?
Yeah, this topic of purpose has always been interesting to me. I come from a religious tradition. I grew up in a family that talked about service to others and relationships and things like that. So the topic of where do we find purpose and meaning in life was always interesting to me. And then when I got into my career, um, I was one of those, I grew up in a family with pretty modest means. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go out and kind of change the financial trajectory of my own life. And I got into a couple of jobs and I was grinding really hard. And eventually got to the point where I was burning out a little bit and losing the why of what I was doing, not from a corporate value statement perspective, but from an individual perspective, right? Much of my why was just the day to day of trying to create a career and get ahead. And not enough of it was actually anchored in a deeper why for me of why I was doing what I was doing or what was I made to do. So I started writing about this in 2009, effectively. A few colleagues and I in business school wrote a book called Passion and Purpose about next generation leadership. And we didn't actually intend to focus on purpose in that, but it became this theme that we heard over and over again with the 25 people that we profiled, with the hundreds that we interviewed. We were a generation that came of age around the dot-com collapse, the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, the subsequent great financial crisis, which was when we began writing this book. And more people were asking, why am I doing what I'm doing? Right? Why am I doing what I'm doing? What is my purpose? And we kind of addressed it a little bit in that book, but honestly, we didn't have a good answer for that. I remember the first book group I did was at the Harvard Coop, which was the bookstore in Harvard Square. And the first young lady that stood up and asked a question said, "How can I find my purpose?" God, you wrote a book with purpose in the title. How can I find my purpose? And I remember I didn't have like a very good answer for her. And between my own struggles to figure that out in my career and the struggle to define that for others, I use the book, this HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, really as a way to explore my own thinking on the subject and refine it. And so over the course of about a decade, I wrote some articles, I kept talking to audiences, and I formulated what I thought was wrong about that very question, how do I find my purpose? And how we as leaders and individuals might find greater purpose at work or create greater purpose at work, as well as create environments that make that more possible for others.
I love that. And before we get into this, I had thought that would launch us into crafting your purpose, but I first want to look at this idea of having gone into something. And I had the same experience going into the military service and losing my own sense of why I was there personally after some time, not the greater sense. And I think a lot of people have that. I think teachers have been having that in spades recently with all of the changes that have been happening with education. But I think there's a lot of people that go through this, if not once, maybe many times in their lives and their careers. So what do you think happens that causes that kind of a crisis when you go in with an initial idea of, hey, I'm here for this purpose driven reason, but then you get to a place where you think you've lost it?
Yeah, such a great question. And if anyone wants to know how seriously I take my own proposition in this book, I actually made a radical career change in the midst of writing this, partially because of how convicted I felt about some of the principles I was laying out. I would say two things. One is there is a natural rhythm to life by which things that used to give us meaning and purpose sometimes don't anymore. And it's natural to go through different phases of your life and progress to different core forms of meaning and purpose. And I talk about this in the book a lot. I think it's a myth that purpose is something that's stable over time. There are a few people, Mother Teresa's of the world, that find that. Most of us go through different phases of life. And even she did, right? When you're a kid and you're in elementary school, your source of purpose is different than college. It's different than when you're a young professional or a grandparent. And so we kind of know these phases exist, but when we go through them at work, we sometimes panic about them. And I think instead they can just be helpful moments to transition, either within your current organization or job or outside, and just go into a new phase of life where you are exercising meaning and purpose. I think when people face a crisis in a job they've gone into, it's often because they either A, have lost sight of what gave them meaning in the first place and they've gotten too distant from it, or it's often because they've fallen into patterns at work where they're not leaning into the things that really give them meaning in life. So I'll give you an example from my own life. On the latter front, when I took over as a manager initially and became a leader in the organization I previously worked at, I had this leadership philosophy that I'd never asked anyone to do anything that I wouldn't do, and that I would try and take on the difficult things to shield my team. I think the impulse for that was good. Like, I wanted to be known as a guy who would lead from the front, who would do the difficult things, who wouldn't shove things on the team that he wouldn't do. But one of the problems with that, and I got this from a mentor of mine as he was talking through it with me, was he said, the challenge, John, is with well-meaning intent, you've also kind of drained all the things you find joyful from your job. In the process of trying to take on all the difficult stuff, you have made it almost impossible for yourself to feel engaged and meaningful at work. You're trudging to work knowing you're going to face the most difficult things. And he said, you're actually doing a disservice to others because putting them through difficult things can be a part of their development as well. Like, it's almost like over parenting. I don't, employees are not kids, but the concept is analogous, I think, where if you try and protect your kids from everything, you make their lives worse because they don't develop grit and resilience. And the same is true of jobs. And so he said, if you want to stick in this job and be a good leader and stay motivated, you're going to have to emphasize some of the things that you really get meaning and purpose from in your own work. And you're going to have to be comfortable delegating some things to others that give them, that allow them to experience some of the difficulty of working through challenging situations. And until you strike the right balance there, leading from the front, but also being willing to kind of let other people do the same sometimes, you're not going to be able to stick with your job. Like, it doesn't help anybody on your team if you burn out and aren't able to do it anymore. And that balance was helpful to me because I still kind of don't think I should put stuff on others that I wouldn't be willing to do. When things are really bad, I'll often jump in and try and be a part of the team managing that. But I'm much more balanced in how I approach that now so that I can craft my own work in a way that keeps me in the game and keeps me engaged and keeps me moving forward.
That was a part of the book that I really appreciated, was your balance of this enjoyment and of the purpose as being a critical piece of being sustainable in the way that you work and in the way that you lead. I think I have made the same error, and I think there are many well-intended leaders who do the same, right? And that gets to a place where you can't continue then. Let's talk about dispelling myths, because you started out with dispelling 3 myths about purpose, which I think is really important. And I wonder if you could speak to those 3 myths and how it is that you identified those 3 in particular, and how it is that we might begin to dispel those in our quest to become more purposeful in our lives and our work.
Well, I'm a slow learner, Shannon, so it took me some time, but that very first question, it really hung with me. I mean, I would sit and think about it. How do I find my purpose? Because it was the kind of question that I would ask. And at first, I couldn't figure out why it was so hard to answer. And over a couple of years, I came to believe that the question itself contained these 3 fundamental flaws in the way that we think about purpose. The first of those is that purpose is something we find rather than something that we create or craft. Right? We have this idea that purpose or meaning is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, that if we just like stumble into it, our lives can be meaningful. It's kind of like all the movies with the hero's journey, Neo and the Matrix, where you take the red pill and suddenly you've got this purpose in life. A lot of people are waiting for that. And instead, I think we have agency over our own lives, which is a liberating concept. We don't have to wait for something. We don't have to find it. We don't have to struggle to come to grips with it. We have the opportunity to proactively engage and try and make different parts of our life, including our work, meaningful. So that was the first myth. It's not something you find, it's something you build. The second was this idea that we just talked about, that purpose is stable over time. So in that question, how do I find my purpose? The idea is, and I think this is what she intended, this is what I would intend asking that question. How do I find this like job that's going to give me purpose forever? Right? The Mother Teresa job. And instead, I think that we all go through phases of life with our personal and professional purpose. And I think we'll come to that point in a moment, where it changes, where it shifts, where you're just in a different period of life, right? And again, if you just reflect on people you've seen graduate college or retire or have kids, we know this is true, but it's so difficult for us to accept in our careers, I think. And instead, I think we should get comfortable not with giving up on things. We should have grit and resilience, but that also there are moments in life where you should shift your attention. You should change what you're working on, where it makes sense for purpose to be something new for you, and be comfortable with that, embrace that process. And then the third in that, how do I find my purpose, is that purpose is a single thing rather than multiple things. And I think that is perhaps the most dangerous concept, because anytime we try and define our lives by one thing, whether it's a career or a relationship, an extracurricular, the danger in that is when that goes away, um, our whole purpose is gone, right? This is where you see people have a crisis because of a job or a relationship. I think the right way to build a life is to recognize that there's purpose around us all the time. The young lady who asked that question was in clubs. She had a family, she had friends, she served her community. I was doing the same. But we become so single minded when we think about purpose, often either on a family, if someone's staying home, or on a job, that we lose sight of all these other areas of life. And so I really encourage people not to think about purpose singular, but purpose is. And how can you build this tapestry or web of purpose around everything that you do, so that you constantly have this source of meaning and purpose in your life from different angles? It also means you're not so reliant on any one thing. If a job goes away, you've got your kids, you've got your community, you've got your spouse, you've got all these other things that keep you in the game. Um, and I think building a life like that, that's balanced and emphasizes purpose in multiple ways, is smarter than focusing on a singular purpose. And so those were the three myths we go through.
It's really important to deconstruct them in that way, I think. And I'm so grateful that you did, because it is something that I think people get hung up on, and we all get hung up on, because there's this tendency to want to connect. And, even if you think about Mother Teresa, I know I have read that Mother Teresa didn't feel that sense, didn't feel that connection to God for most of her life. And she continued to do the work, but she also did that work in community, right? So and you talk about this as well. And I really appreciated this, that there is this need for service, which most of us have, whether or not we've articulated it exactly that way, but there's that need for service. There's a need for mastery, maybe that individual element of it. And there's a need for a connection to something greater. And for Mother
Yes.
Teresa, it was God, although she didn't feel that for most of her career and her life, which is, I think, a completely fascinating element of it. And I have thought of it, and I'd love to run this by you, as a Polaris principle, with this idea that our North Star, or the North Star that is Polaris, is actually three different stars. So purpose, in many regards, it seems to me, can rotate among these ideas of relationship, and that could be community, and it can be family, and it could be any kind of relationship, something larger than ourselves, and then something that is about mastery or about craft or about contribution.
Yeah, and I think there are certain North Stars that are more stable than others when we talk about
Yes.
transitioning purpose. And we talk about this in the book because I get questions from parents or from religious believers a lot. I totally make room for the idea that there are things that are stable over time. Like some people's religious faith is their anchor for their lifetimes, and I think that can be very appropriate. As a parent, I know I've signed up for that to be a core part of my purpose forever, even on the days I don't feel in the game, like you signed up to be responsible for people. And that's got to be a core part of who you are. I think that about my marriage as well. And so there are things that I would kind of exempt from this phases of purpose. Like once you take them on, they can be quite permanent. But many of the other offshoots of that, whether it be your job, your hobbies, even the way in which you relate to those relationships in your life, like your kid, that transitions, over time quite dramatically. And so I do think I like this idea that it is three stars, that you're looking at different things in the way that you phrase it. And again, what I'd emphasize is, some of those are more permanent and more anchors in our life than others. And some of them can be quite transient. And we just have to know in our lives what those are and be able to differentiate between them clearly.
Yes, absolutely. One of your frameworks that you offer for people who are beginning to build their purpose, and the concept of agency here is so important, and I'm so grateful that you've really pulled that out because there is individual agency here, and it's not just stumbling across it. And I remember as a young person wishing that I had stumbled across my one purpose and making that mistake that we've just dispelled in the myths that you've brought out and pulled apart here. So as one is looking to create or to build or to discern maybe the purpose that, or one of the areas of purpose that's going to be a big piece of their lives, you've constructed a framework that you've put under the title of labors. Can you speak to labors? Because I think it's a really good one and a good place for people to start.
And Shannon, I would just emphasize something you said, and it's probably come up in your work on grit and resilience. One of the primary ways in which people feel engaged is agency. And one of the
Yes.
primary ways in which people feel disaffected is when they feel they have no control over their own lives, no control over their own work. The most miserable employees are those who feel like they have no input into the work that they're doing and they have no autonomy or agency to do it the way that they want to. And so I think for anyone to display real grit and resilience or to be very happy in what they're doing, they have to have some measure of agency or autonomy in their lives. And so I just think that that concept is quite important for people to think about. The labors was a little framework I put together just to almost give people a checklist on, I say you have multiple sources of purpose in your life, but where might those multiple sources be? Like if I'm looking to build this tapestry of purpose in my life, what are the different areas that I might build that in? And so I came up with this kind of 6-part framework where you could just go through that and say, do I have 2 or 3 things that are really giving me meaning in this area? And if not, maybe that's an area that I need to build out. Labors is not a magical word. It's the only word I could create out of the different words that I was trying to combine. So, and it's memorable enough. But
Yes, for
it's
sure.
a labor of love. So the L actually does stand for love in relationships. And all of the social science research basically says that the number one determinant of a person's happiness and fulfillment is in life is the depth and breadth of their positive relationships. You see that in Harvard Grant study, you see it in Martin Seligman's work, you see it in the Harvard Flourishing Project's work. Um, it's so easy to lose that, but you have to have real positive, deep connections with others, key relationships in your life, whether away from work or at work, to be truly happy and fulfilled. And so that's where I start because I think everyone needs to have sources of love and connection in their life. And if you don't have those, you really need to work on getting that settled before almost anything else. The A is for avocations or hobbies. I think it's really important for people to have things away from their work and away from their jobs as parents or as family members that keep them interested and engaged. Um, that could be running, it could be knitting, it could be writing books like a big nerd like me, could be golfing, it could be anything where you've adopted something that engages you physically or mentally, that you can actually hone a craft, where you can participate in community. And those avocations or hobbies outside of work almost give you, like I said, this multiple support framework so that if a relationship fails or work fails, or you're just feeling a need to escape, you've got this place to go for that. The B is actually for beauty, which is something that a lot of professionals don't think about. I'm staring at your background right now, which is the most beautiful mountains in the world. You're following the advice better than I.
Well, I love that you brought out beauty because you don't. I do a lot of work in creative nonfiction and poetry as well, and that certainly is a big component of that part of my life and work. But it hasn't been in this part of my life and work, and I love that you included it in this acronym.
Totally. And, one of the things is I talked to people during COVID quite a lot. Um, they said, a lot of stuff was bad. But when I started taking calls, doing a walk in the park, because we couldn't be inside, I couldn't go to the office, everything was virtual. So many people started taking calls outside or doing walks in the park. And it was amazing how energizing that was for people, myself included. And even some of the research on job crafting, one of the studies followed hospital janitors and who was getting the most fulfillment from their job. And it was the people who tweaked their jobs to be more meaningful. And one of those people would rotate the artwork of long-term hospital patients around the hospital rooms so that those long-term patients could get different artwork, different sources of beauty. And I just think it's easy when we work in office environments, we can stare at the same cubicle or wall every day. You've got to find ways to get out from that. Go to a museum. I mean, your kids can be a source of beauty. You can take up painting. You can get outside and hike more. But beauty is something that's so intrinsically good and it's often missing from our lives, especially as professionals. And so I just thinking finding some sources of that is important. The O in labors is for occupation, your work. I mean, we've talked about that quite a bit, but do you get meaning and purpose from work? And the question I put to people all the time, because so many people say, my job is my job, and then I'm going to get purpose and meaning and all that stuff out of it. And it's like, man, you are going to work 35 to 55 hours a week on average. This is where you spend more time than you do with your family, more time than you do on your hobbies. It would be a real shame to go through life and not feel engaged at work and not feel that your work is purposeful. And so many people write off their occupation. It's 80% according to the surveys in terms of engagement. And I just think that's a really sad commentary on workplaces and a place we need to invest. Um, the R is for religious or philosophical tradition. The Harvard Flourishing Project talks about this in terms of character and virtue. I think all of us will get greater meaning in the work and the lives that we lead if we anchor ourselves in an understanding of what we think the good life is. And typically that comes from some religious or philosophical tradition. I don't try and be prescriptive about that in the book. I think that's a journey everyone has to go on. But like beauty, it's one a lot of people ignore or push to the side. They kind of don't want to deal with the big questions. But I think it's hard to build a flourishing life without anchoring in some answer to life's biggest questions about what direction you're going, what bigger power, higher power you're serving. Um, and then the S is for service to others. And, I mentioned that relationships in the social science research is the core determinant of fulfillment in a person's life. It's the number one thing. Usually, number two or three in those surveys is service to others. There is just incontrovertible evidence that's echoed by, I mean, your grandmother told you this, but every social science survey tells you this too. When you get outside of yourself and you do something good for others, that is the best thing you can do psychologically for yourself. Service to others unleashes in you a sense of meaning and purpose and happiness and fulfillment that's surprising to people, in addition to being incredible for others, right? It's this win-win situation where you get to go do something awesome for someone else. And in the process of that, you activate this part of your human spirit that makes you have a more meaningful life as well. And so that's where I push people to is like, just go through your life. And service to others doesn't have to be like a philanthropy. Like you can take an attitude of service at work. You can view all of your colleagues as people you could serve. I also think it's good to find a way to serve others in the community or others in your life, whether it's a soup kitchen or, if you're a stay-at-home dad or mom and you're all day with the kids, I mean, that's a real act of service and sacrifice. But finding a way to kind of get outside of the narcissism, just focusing on yourself, to focus on others and really think about how you can improve the lives of others. It's this paradox where that also improves your life as well. So those are the 6 categories that I walk through.
If you've been asking yourself, what's the point of all of this? Not just in your job, but in your life, you're not alone. Most high achievers I work with aren't lacking drive. They're lacking direction that actually matters. That's why I built Leading with Purpose at the Grit Institute. It's a step-by-step path to reconnect with what drives you, leads you, and sustains you, especially when things get hard. If you're tired of just checking boxes and you're ready to lead with intention, go to thegritinstitute.com/purpose/ and start Leading with Purpose today. So that's really helpful. And again, I think more expansive necessarily than most of these considerations around purpose. So I'm, again, grateful for your work around that. Let's getting back to the idea of work. And I have thought sometimes that we hear that millennials are demanding of purpose in their work. And sometimes I have thought a little bit that maybe we can't expect everything of a work environment any more than we can expect everything from our spouses or our partners, right? In terms of what we need emotionally. And so I love that you're talking about agency and creating that purpose both inside of work and outside of work and the necessity of that. And I think it also goes back to this idea that there are many places that we draw purpose. If you have a recent video up on LinkedIn that is talking about the tendency, and I am seeing this as well, and I find it really disturbing, of Gen Z. And I don't know if the millennials would fit into this as much. I think, again, I haven't seen the same commentary there, but that Gen Z is focused almost exclusively on money, and it is really concerning. And I wonder, both in the workplace and in terms of character development outside of the workplace, whether it's at home or whether it's in the school environment, what's happened there, and how can we start to shift that narrative?
Yeah. So the next project I'm working on is actually on money and how money can be a good thing rather than a bad thing in your life. Basically every religion and philosophy tells you money is uniquely dangerous, whether it's like beat poets or Muslim tradition or Christian tradition. All of these like very wise traditions warn people that money can be a good thing, but it can often be incredibly destructive, right? Somehow we've lost that. There was a Wall Street Journal poll that you might be referring to where they surveyed what's important to a person in their life, and everything was going off a cliff: family, religion, um, patriotism, all these other factors. The only thing that was going up was money. And I think it's a combination of factors, honestly, Shannon. I mean, money has been uniquely tempting forever, and we can talk about the personal part of that. But I think as all these other sources of meaning and purpose have faded away, as people have left community organizations, left churches or synagogues, have not started families as much, so people are getting married later, they're having kids later, typically. And I'm not criticizing any individual choice. I'm just saying, as a society, these traditional sources of meaning have declined. And so, what's one scoreboard that everybody can point to? Right? It's money, and so much of social media reflects that. If you go on Instagram or TikTok, it's influencers who are showing off cars and all these things. And in my industry, I work in investments. It's so easy to focus on money because money is clear. You can measure it. You know if you're doing well in it. You can get ahead there. And there's this belief that if I just get enough, that will buy me all these other things. And that is such a dangerous mythology, right? All of the evidence, and I'm writing quite extensively about this right now, is that money is a means to flourishing, but not an end. The Harvard Project on Human Flourishing has six categories of human flourishing. Money and financial well-being is one of those, but it very explicitly, it's the only category that's not an end in itself. Relationships are an end in themselves. Character and virtue are an end in themselves. Meaningful work is an end in itself, et cetera. Health and wellness are an end in itself. They're good intrinsically. Financial well-being is only as important as it allows you to get those other things. And so you're desperately poor. When I was born, we lived in a single wide trailer in the middle of Florida, super hot. When you're poor, it's hard, and it can be hard to achieve flourishing because you don't have the freedom to do many of the things that you need to do to create flourishing. But there is a threshold above which you've found that freedom, right? And focusing on the money part of that rather than all these intrinsic things that you should totally be chasing is actually destructive and corrosive to a person's life, right? We've all seen this. Like, I know billionaires who are deeply unhappy people because all they know how to focus on is being a billionaire. And in the process of getting there, they have destroyed relationships. They've destroyed their capacity for service. They've stopped seeing beauty in things. They've become skeptical of people. They don't have a sense of character and virtue that makes them proud of themselves or the work that they're doing. And if you achieve that financial, scorecard, your financial Polaris, but you don't use it to get these other things, I think that's what's particularly corrosive. And I think the danger of money is because it's so easy to measure and manage that it can take the place of all these more difficult subjects, right? And so my counsel is never, I was talking to some young people the other day, you should get paid fairly for the work that you do. You should absolutely try and achieve financial independence for yourself and get yourself agency and autonomy, and no one should criticize you for that. But if you begin to focus on money so much that that becomes your only goal and it distracts you from pursuing the intrinsically beautiful things in life, you've lost the thread and it could actually start to destroy your life. And I think like this purpose and meaning topic, I think that attraction to money is something we revisit every few generations. And I think our generation is going to have to grapple with it as well.
Yes, for sure. I'm so glad you're doing work in that area. I've had actually a couple of young people, and I say young, younger than I am by 15 years or so, let's say, who, but maybe they have young children, maybe they're in different stages of this building a family. And a couple of them have said things to me in the course of volunteer work that I've done in our community, which have really surprised me, which is basically the question of why do you do that if you don't get paid? And I thought it was such a funny question. And I thought, well, gosh, look around us. I mean, and again, I grew up maybe like you did, where in our family, in our church community, in our overall community, I saw a lot of examples of service. It was modeled, it was discussed. I find great satisfaction in it. But I just thought that was the most interesting question, that it came from two different people about two different examples of activity or service. And they said, why would you do that if you didn't get paid? And I thought, well, yeah, of course it's important to be paid for good work that you do and the work that I do professionally. I expect that, of course. But I just was so surprised that they would come at something that way. And I don't see people in that generation, maybe a half a generation, I don't know if that's a full generation below me, engaging as much in that service that has been so foundational in so many ways. What is happening with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think it's restricted to Gen Z. I think it's a broader societal movement right now. I think it's been happening since the greatest generation. There's been a kind of decline in other centeredness in our society. And I think I've tried to grapple with this as well, because I think some of it comes from either different groups or individuals having felt manipulated or abused over time. Like people who were taken advantage of, who are not properly rewarded for what they do. So there are situations where, again, I would counsel people, when you do a good job, you should be rewarded for that. You should feel free to talk to your employer or your company about whether your financial rewards are in line with what you're doing. Like, there's nothing wrong with making sure that you're appropriately compensated for things. Um, all of life can't be about personal compensation. I've seen this too. There's a kind of very there's almost like a self-centered ethos that's going around now, where everything is about you getting what's yours, as
Yes.
in all your life. And again, it's like this kernel of truth in there, which is, don't you shouldn't be taken advantage of. People should not manipulate and abuse you. But instead of staying in its appropriate area, right, or its appropriate realm of life, it becomes all encompassing, so that you think your time is yours, and that you can't see a reason you would give that. It's almost a transactional way of going through life, where you're bartering things for everything else. And it destroys, I think, the social cohesion of a society where we've all needed help without being able to give something in return before, right? And what- we may need that in the future. And your ability to help a friend, to help a community, to give your time philanthropically, even to help a colleague once in a while who can't really pay you back for it but needs you, that part of the human condition. You're going to need it for others, and you should be willing to offer that to others. And again, embedded in that is a deeper sense of service, where I think you have to die to self a little bit. I mean, I think the thing that really, I grew up in a Christian home, and we always emphasized service to others for sure. And I saw my parents doing that. I don't really think I got it until I became a dad. And you really just like have to die to yourself. And the kids, other than being super cute and loving you, you do get payment for it. They love you so much. They're never going to be able to do for you what you do for them. And you are never going to be able to prioritize your own needs over them again if you're going to be a good parent. But there is also like an incredible liberation in just coming to terms with that and saying, I am not the center of this relationship. Those kids, I'm going to pour myself into them. They're never going to pay me back for it. They're going to love me, which is payment enough. Sometimes they're going to tell me they hate me sometimes, but
Yes, I had that this morning.
we all, but you reach this moment in parenting, or most of us do, where we say, I'm not the center of this story anymore. Like, kids are the center of this story, and my investment in them is something I'm just willing to give freely. And that's a liberating concept that can actually apply more broadly in life. And I don't think I totally got service until I had kids for that reason. And now it's easier for me to look at different parts of my life and say, is this really about me? And is this more transactional? Or is this a moment where I'm not the important part here? This other person or cause is the important part. And I'm just going to invest myself into that to the best of my abilities. And I think our
Yes.
ability to do that in areas of our life really, if you never learn to do that, I think it's very difficult to lead a fully fulfilled human life.
Yes. Or lead a company or lead a
Really,
family
oh,
or lead anything. Yeah,
oh yeah.
that's right.
You'll
I
never
have, what's
yeah,
that?
you'll never see a great leader negotiating every single thing that they do and saying like, "Whoa." I mean, there was this story, there's all this NIL in college football, and there were a couple of football players that showed up to their coach right before the college football playoff and said, "You paid me NIL money for 12 games, not 14. I'm not going to play in the playoff unless you pay me more." And it's like, I kind of get it. I kind of get it, but at the same time, like, I don't know if you live your life that way, it's going to be very difficult to inspire others, right? And for
Yes.
others to really trust you in the relationships that you build.
Yes. I've thought about both the family relationship as well as, especially being a parent, to some degree, the marriage relationship and faith as well as, and to some degree, leadership in some sense. There is a surrender, right? And we don't like to surrender, but it's central to faith. It's central to love and relationship. And that is a giving up of oneself. And I also really appreciate that you start this acronym of labors with the idea of love, which is something we've started to bring back into conversations about leadership and business again, which, or maybe for the first time, but is a central component ultimately to really being able to lead is decentering yourself, centering the ideas, centering the purpose and the mission, but centering the people more than anything else, I think.
Well, in love, my wife and I talk about this all the time, not to make this like a marriage podcast, but real love, when you get down to it, is a decision, not a feeling. Like if you live your life feeling in love or out of love, it's going to be tough, right? You talk about grit and resilience. Like if you're going to make a marriage work, it takes a lot of grit and resilience because there are times you don't feel in love. There were times Mother Teresa didn't feel the presence of God. But what you do is you decide in advance, I love this person with your kids. I love this person unconditionally. There's nothing they can do to ruin that. And I'm going to fight through the tough stuff. I'm going to be there for them no matter what, to the best of my ability. We all fail on this stuff. I don't want to paint myself as like, we all fail. I need love sometimes in a difficult person. But that's like intrinsic in this idea of really deep love is this idea of self sacrifice and other centeredness. And those two are inseparable in my mind because if you just navigate life by feelings, you'll get kind of transactional and impermanent relationships because real love and real relationship requires working through difficult problems and self-sacrifice and periods where you're not the center of the story. And again, there's a balance because we all know people who have been in love and have been um, abused in different senses of the word and that not necessarily bad at all. You absolutely should have boundaries. Uh, but anybody in a functional relationship also knows there are times when you have to put the other person at the center of what you're doing, right? And work through things. And so I think learning that concept which you outlined is so important to relationship.
And that comes back to agency, doesn't it? Whether it's love, whether it's purpose, whatever it is that you are doing in your life. I always think that anything that matters is a verb. It's not a feeling. It's not anything else. It's not a thing to have. It's a verb. It's something that you do. You lead. You're not just a leader, right? You love. You're not just married. So all of those things have to be verbs and active decisions that come from that sense of agency and that sense of responsibility that owns that agency, I think.
I totally agree. And you're the expert on grit and resilience, but I think that's central to having those qualities as well, because the ability to fight through the most difficult circumstances is almost like a pre-commitment. Like you are going to try and strive through this no matter what. And you have to be willing to overcome the obstacles in order to do that because it can get quite difficult. And so I don't want to put words in your mouth and you're the expert on this, but I think those two concepts are tied as well. I don't know if you feel
No,
this.
they absolutely are. I think this all very much syncs together. And the other piece that I thought about yesterday, actually out on a walk, as you tend to think on walks, and I do love that COVID put us more into that mode if we weren't there already, but was how purpose and purpose actually, I'd love your thoughts on this as well, is I think of it as based in deep values, but being directional. And being directional means, you're tethered to what matters the most, but that can vary over time with those 3 stars of Polaris. And that in some sense, when you get right down to purpose and the real essence of what William Damon would call a noble purpose. I don't know if you know his work, but he's I'll send you some information on him after the podcast. If not, he's worth reading. But the idea of a noble purpose is that it is almost love itself, isn't it? Like it is living directionally into something that is greater than yourself, and there is something of love that is very much, I think, a part of purpose in that way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, everybody wants to be on a mission. We talk about this around the company a lot, and maybe this connects to the professional side. If you're in a job without a mission, it's hard to be engaged. If you're on a mission, you talked about military service and, in terms of where people rate purpose, I know you mentioned you struggle with it at different times, but, I think something like the Marines was like the number one area that rated them, and in different is in military service, because most military service people at various times know what their mission is. They know what it is in aggregate. They know what it is with their unit, with the people that they live with on a day-to-day basis, and they feel it's meaningful. And that missional orientation gets you through a really tough job, whether you're the cook or you're the driver or you're out in the field fighting. Like all those are hard and you're away from your family a bunch and all that stuff. But people can strive through it because they have this deep sense of mission, right? And I think that is genuinely what's lacking from so many workplaces. And as a leader, if you think about what you can do as a leader to help others, one is to free people up with agency to help discover their own purpose and really craft it into their work. But secondly, each leader needs to think about what mission are we on, right? You don't just work at a company, you work towards a goal, a mission and a vision. And have you set that in an inspiring enough way that people feel invested in that? Or are they just punching the clock every day, right? And the former is hard, but that's how you build remarkable cultures that make people better. And it's worth striving.
So good. And then at the end of the day, once we do our work on or help our people at work do their work on their individual purpose, and we connect it to that mission and to that vision, right? And that connection point seems to me to be where that real magic happens, that real transformation of cultures.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much. I so appreciate your wisdom, the many years that you've put into thinking about this and crafting this and the work that you've written and the work that you're putting out into the world. It's especially important right now. And I concur completely with this concept of a crisis of purpose. We are in a crisis of purpose, and in every part of our communities and our society, there's a real need for us to refocus and to make it work.
Well, and I love, Shannon, the focus of your work with grit and resilience. I mean, I talk all the time about the 2 or 3 things I look for in people that I want to work with. And intellectual curiosity is consistently one, care for others is one, but grit and resilience is something that I focus on all the time, because until you've got folks who are willing to fight through difficult circumstances, have the grit to achieve, who have this action orientation, it's so difficult to achieve anything together. So I love the fact that you're hosting a podcast on this, that your work is oriented around this. I think it's one of the most important things that people can learn. So thank you for having me on, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it. I know everyone listening or watching today came away with greater clarity, courage, and practical tools that you can put into practice right now to live and lead with purpose and with your grit factor. Thank you, listener, for leaning into grit, for embracing purpose, and for choosing leadership that endures to make this world a better place. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who's navigating challenge. Subscribe so you won't miss future conversations, and if you would, leave a review. It helps others find the show. For more from John Coleman, check out his HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose. There's a link in the show notes, and his other books as well. They're full of frameworks as well as stories to help clarify your purpose and act on it. And if you're ready to strengthen your grit and lead with purpose in every area of your life, head over to thegritinstitute.com, where you'll find courses, coaching, and resources built for the journey. I'm Shannon Huffman Polson. Keep facing the wind, lead and live with purpose and with the Grit Factor.